The first time the chalk appeared on the sidewalk, it felt like nothing more than a whisper of color in a gray world, a scattering of uneven stars, stick, figure planets, crooked houses, and names spelled backward by small hands that still mixed fantasy with reality. And for Mark Henderson, that fragile explosion of color felt like proof that his children were still alive inside despite everything they had been through. Despite the quiet house that once echoed with laughter, now echoing with memory. Despite the long nights after work, when exhaustion pressed into his bones like wet cement, and the mornings when he barely recognized the man staring back at him in the bathroom mirror. And he never imagined that something so harmless would become the fuse to a war that would consume his stability, his finances, and eventually an entire neighborhood's sense of justice. Mark had not planned to become a single father. The role had been forced on him when everything he thought was permanent crumbled in one brutal season, leaving him with 2 children who looked to him for safety, warmth, and answers he did not always have the strength to give, and a mortgage that now felt like a second job, and a neighborhood that promised community but delivered rules, surveillance, and smiles that never reached the eyes. The Henderson home sat on the edge of the subdivision where sidewalks made looping curves past identical houses and manicured lawns shaped into perfection by hidden pressure. And it was there that the chalk drawings lived, reborn every few days after rain washed away the previous generation of art, the children kneeling low to the concrete in quiet defiance of sadness, drawing dreams bigger than their world. For weeks, nothing happened, no warnings, no letters, no looks beyond the usual polite waves exchanged between neighbors who never truly knew one another. And Mark allowed himself to believe that this small corner of joy would be spared the reach of the HOA invisible hand. But the HOA had always been watching, and it always chose its moments carefully. The first notice arrived folded neatly in the mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon marked by unpaid bills, laundry that never seemed to end, and the deep tiredness that lived behind Mark's eyes, and at first he barely glanced at it, assuming it was another community update about landscaping or trash bins, but as his eyes passed over the bolded violation code and the attached fine amount, something inside him tightened slowly, almost gently, like the beginning of a trap closing. The chalk drawings had been labeled a visual nuisance, a community standard violation, an unauthorized alteration to shared property, and with that sterile language came a fine large enough to swallow a week's worth of groceries, and a warning that repeat offenses would carry escalating penalties. Mark sat at the kitchen table staring at the paper long after the children had grown restless from hunger, reading the words again and again as if repetition might turn them into something else, as if understanding would make them reasonable, and all the while the chalk outside remained untouched, the colors bright and defiant against the gray concrete, unaware that they had just been declared an enemy of order. He paid the fine without protest that month, cutting corners where he could, shifting money meant for other things, convincing himself it was an isolated misunderstanding, that logic would surely prevail next time, but logic had no home inside the HOA system, only procedure, enforcement, and a quiet satisfaction that came from control. The second fine arrived 2 weeks later after a fresh set of drawings bloomed across the sidewalk following a rare evening when the children had laughed without restraint, chasing each other as the sun set and the chalk dust lingered in the air like colored smoke. And this time the amount had doubled, and this time the language carried sharper edges, referencing habitual disregard and future legal escalation. Panic entered Mark's chest like cold water, sudden and breath-stealing, and he began to feel the weight of something larger moving against him, something impersonal and relentless that did not see children, only rules, and as he stood on the front porch holding the notice while the chalk lay at his feet, he felt the first true fracture inside the fragile stability he had built since everything fell apart. He scrubbed the drawings away that night under porch light with a stiff brush and a steady ache in his arms, watching the colors dissolve into pale rivers that ran into the street, and he told himself that compliance would protect his children from further harm, that surrender was a form of shielding, but as the last faint outline disappeared, something inside him disappeared with it as well. The weeks that followed were quieter, the sidewalk bare, the children subdued, the house heavier with unspoken disappointment, and Mark worked longer shifts trying to recover from the financial blow, unaware that the quiet was not mercy but recalibration, that somewhere inside the HOA machinery, his address had been flagged not as resolved but as monitored. When the third violation arrived, it came without chalk, without color, without trigger, citing residue traces and prior habitual noncompliance, and the fine attached to it dwarfed the others combined. And this time there was no warning, only instruction, and with that paper in his trembling hand, Mark finally understood that he was no longer dealing with enforcement, but with pursuit. The realization settled slowly, as all devastating truths do, that he was not being corrected, he was being targeted, that his poverty, his vulnerability, his exhaustion had marked him as safe prey for a system that fed on submission. And as the children slept in the next room and the quiet house pressed in around him, Mark felt the first flicker of something he had not allowed himself to feel since before his life collapsed, a dangerous, unfamiliar heat beneath the fear, the earliest trace of defiance beginning to glow. By the time Mark realized the HOA was no longer reacting but actively hunting for reasons to punish him, the machinery was already in motion, and it moved with a quiet, bureaucratic cruelty that made every attempt at reason feel childish and naive. Because each new violation arrived cloaked in legal language, so dense it felt designed to exhaust rather than inform. And the third fine became a fourth within days, then a fifth, each citing technicalities so microscopic they seemed almost invented: residue markings, discoloration memory, community aesthetic degradation, and with each envelope that slid through his mailbox the sense of being watched intensified, until it felt like eyes lived inside the walls, behind hedges, beneath polite smiles exchanged on morning walks that now carried an unspoken judgment. Mark stopped sleeping properly, his rest fractured by the constant calculations running through his mind, how many overtime hours it would take to survive the next fine, what bill could be delayed without cutting off essentials, how long until the thin rope holding his finances together finally snapped, and through it all his children grew quieter, their laughter fading into cautious whispers that drifted through the house like ghosts of their former selves. The sidewalk stayed clean now, not a single smear of color dared to appear, yet the fines kept coming, proof that compliance had never been the goal, only dominance, and even when Mark submitted written appeals through the official HOA channels, each one vanishing into administrative silence. Replies that eventually returned were identical form letters stamped with finality, signatures without names, authority without accountability. The neighborhood itself began to shift around him in subtle, suffocating ways, small acts of social withdrawal that carried more weight than open hostility ever could. Neighbors who once nodded now looked through him. Invitations to community events stopped arriving at his door, and the unspoken verdict traveled by rumor faster than any official notice could, branding him as a problem resident, a rule breaker, a risk to property values, and in a neighborhood built on conformity, that label might as well have been exile. Mark tried to shield his children from the tension, but children were sensitive creatures, and they felt the cold air settle long before the adults named the storm. And one night, as he tucked them into bed, their questions came softly: why the sidewalk had to be so empty now, why they weren't allowed to draw anymore, why the people who smiled before now looked angry. And with each question, his heart folded inward under the weight of truths he could not fully explain without breaking something fragile inside them. The next escalation arrived not on paper but in person, when a violation inspector photographed the sidewalk at dawn with the blank efficiency of someone documenting a crime scene, the camera lens clicking like a mechanical heartbeat that mirrored the one pounding inside Mark's chest as he watched from his front window, feeling stripped bare by the act of being recorded, cataloged, reduced to a case number inside a system that would never know his name. Another fine followed, this one framed as inspection costs, and it tipped the balance from panic into paralysis, because the numbers no longer aligned with any version of reality he could survive, and for the first time since the nightmare began, Mark could no longer convince himself that endurance alone would see him through. He met with a low-cost legal advisor recommended by a coworker, sitting across from a tired desk piled with other people's disasters, and as he laid out the stack of violation notices like a deck of losing cards, the advisor's expression shifted from confusion to concern to something darker that lived somewhere between recognition and dread, and when the advisor finally spoke, it was not with reassurance but with quiet honesty, explaining that HOA operated within powerful boundaries, that their internal rules often outweighed common sense, that fighting them was possible but rarely bloodless, and that the path ahead would not be short. Truth landed heavily, not as a dramatic blow, but as a slow pressing weight that settled into Mark's ribcage and made each breath feel deliberate. And when he returned home that evening, the house greeted him with its familiar stillness, dinner waiting cold on the table, the children asleep earlier than usual, as if exhaustion had claimed them before the day truly ended. And for the first time since becoming a single father, Mark allowed himself to sit in the dark without pretending strength for anyone else. The next move from the HOA came not as a fine, but as a legal notice of potential lien, a sterile declaration that the unpaid balance from escalating fees now constituted grounds for property action. And the word lien echoed in his thoughts with a terror that surpassed every fine before it, because a fine could be paid with pain, but a lien threatened the last physical anchor he had managed to provide for his children, the walls that still held their memories, the rooms that whispered stability even as the outside world tried to strip it away. Fear transformed into fury in quiet increments, not in loud explosions, but in the steady sharpening of resolve. And when Mark stood on his porch that morning, holding the lien notice, as the sun climbed over identical rooftops, he saw the neighborhood no longer as a place of refuge, but as a controlled environment built to punish weakness and reward silence. First act of resistance came not from him but from the children, who returned from school that afternoon unwilling to stay quiet any longer, carrying bruised disappointment like a secret in their backpacks, and though no chalk touched the sidewalk that day, the simple act of their request reignited something Mark had buried beneath survival, reminding him of the thin, dangerous line between protecting them and teaching them to shrink. And in that moment he understood that the HOA had already taken far more than money. It had taken color, expression, and the belief that harmless joy should not require permission. That night, as the house settled into uneasy sleep, and the violation notices lay stacked on the kitchen table like a paper monument to oppression, Mark opened his laptop not in desperation, but with intent, searching community forums, legal case archives, and obscure county statutes, tracing threads of stories that mirrored his own, learning that other families had been buried under smaller versions of this same machine, that patterns existed, that loopholes breathed quietly inside dense legal language if one learned how to listen for them. And with each document he read, the fear that once ruled his thoughts began to be joined by something colder and steadier, the slow architecture of strategy taking shape in its place. Outside, the sidewalk remained empty beneath the streetlights, a stretch of concrete scrubbed clean of rebellion. But inside Mark's mind, the first outlines of a battle long overdue were beginning to form. And though he did not yet know how far the war would go, he knew with aching certainty that submission had already cost him too much, and surrender would cost him everything. Mark's search for understanding turned into an obsession that consumed every spare minute of his life, every quiet hour after the children fell asleep, every early morning before the sun rose, and the weight of another working day pressed down on his shoulders. And the deeper he dug into the archived cases, the more clearly he began to see that what was happening to him was not an isolated punishment, but a calibrated method of pressure that had been refined over years, a structure designed not for justice but for compliance through exhaustion and fear. He learned how vague language became a weapon when carefully wielded, how aesthetic noncompliance could be stretched to mean almost anything, how habitual offense required no new act if the association believed intent still lingered like a stain, and how fines could be stacked not as corrections but as leverage. And with each revelation, the system's cold precision became clearer, like seeing the gears of a trap from the inside as it slowly tightened. His unpaid balance grew despite his efforts, not because he refused to pay, but because the escalation outpaced human endurance, a financial chase he could never truly win. And with the lien threat looming larger, the fear that his children might one day wake up without that familiar roof above their heads hardened around his chest like a second rib cage. At work, his performance began to fracture under the strain, small mistakes slipping through where once there had been steady reliability. And though his supervisor showed patience at first, sympathy could only hold its ground for so long against numbers, and Mark felt the first tremor of a future where even his job was no longer secure. The neighborhood's quiet hostility sharpened into something more deliberate as well. Not loud confrontation, but coordinated distance, as if an invisible signal had passed between doors instructing them when to close and when to turn away. And even the sidewalks seemed to betray him now. Every stretch of concrete transformed from neutral ground into a monitored boundary line. One afternoon, he noticed small chalk marks sprayed near the curb, inspection indicators placed by the HOA contractors to measure conformity, and the irony struck him with bitter clarity that while his children's art had been deemed unacceptable as vandalism, the association's own markings were protected as maintenance. The double standard burned into him with a clarity that could not be unlearned. The HOA board meeting announcement arrived next, tucked into a broader community newsletter that pretended normalcy in bold fonts and cheerful language. And while his name was nowhere mentioned, the timing coincided too perfectly with the Leon notice to be coincidence, and Mark understood that this would not be a public forum for reason, but a demonstration of power staged behind procedural formality. Still, he prepared, not with speeches or arguments but with documents, stacking violation letters, fine schedules, timestamps, photographs, appeal submissions, and the hollow form. Letter rejections into a growing file that felt less like paperwork and more like evidence of a slow-motion ambush. The night before the meeting, he barely slept, his thoughts looping endlessly over worst-case scenarios, imagining words that would be spoken without ever being heard, imagining nods from a board that had already decided the outcome long before he entered the room, and yet beneath the dread, something else stirred, not hope, but the raw awareness that this moment would define the story forward, one way or another. The meeting itself unfolded in a windowless community room stripped of warmth and reduced to function. Rows of plastic chairs facing a long table where the board members sat elevated behind nameplates that almost mocked individuality by the sameness of their rigid structure. And though Mark was not invited to speak officially, his presence alone shifted the air, drawing quiet glances from neighbors who avoided his eyes as if contact itself might implicate them. The discussion moved around him rather than through him, agenda items passing with robotic efficiency before finally settling on enforcement concerns that were never named yet heavy with implication. And as the board members spoke in neutral tones about maintaining standards and protecting property values, Mark saw with unblinking clarity that he was no longer viewed as a person, but as a precedent they intended to set. When the vote for enhanced enforcement passed without opposition, it did so with the quiet finality of a door locking behind him, and as the meeting adjourned and chairs scraped across the floor, no one approached him, no one questioned the morality of what was unfolding, and the silence that followed him back into the cold night felt heavier than any shout ever could. The next morning, enforcement arrived in full force, not as a single fine but as a cascade, each one carefully justified by newly expanded interpretations of the rules now strengthened by the previous night's vote. Fence alignment measured to the millimeter, mailbox placement flagged for deviation, minor exterior wear recast as degradation, and what had begun as chalk on concrete metastasized into a full audit of his existence within the boundaries of the community. The message was unmistakable, that this was no longer about drawings. It was about compliance in its purest, most coercive form. The children felt it immediately, their sense of safety thinning as uniformed contractors walked past their windows snapping photographs and scribbling notes. Their world shrinking inward as every outdoor sound now carried threat instead of freedom. And Mark watched their trust erode in small, painful moments he could do nothing to stop, realizing that the HOA had succeeded in turning the outside world into hostile territory. That night, as another thick envelope waited in the mailbox like a silent verdict, Mark's research finally bore its first tangible fruit, a thread of obscure county precedent buried deep within non-publicized court archives, a previous challenge where a homeowner had successfully argued that certain HOA enforcement actions violated broader consumer protection laws when penalties exceeded corrective intent and crossed into punitive extortion. A case that had not dismantled the system but had carved a narrow passage through it. And for the first time since the fines began, Mark felt something close to oxygen enter his lungs. The case was old, fragile, easily buried beneath newer interpretations. But it existed, and existence alone was enough to reshape possibility. With that discovery, his nightly research sharpened into preparation, no longer scavenging hope but assembling argument, tracing legal logic across statutes he barely understood at first, but began to navigate with growing fluency, learning where state authority overrode private governance, where vague HOA language conflicted with county definitions, and how intent could be dissected when enforcement patterns revealed discrimination through escalation rather than correction. Fear did not disappear, but it transformed, no longer a suffocating weight, but a controlled heat that sharpened his focus and anchored him to the path ahead. Outside, the neighborhood moved through its routines untouched by the storm it had unleashed. Lawns trimmed, lights timed, trash bins aligned as if order itself were proof of righteousness. But inside Mark's home, a quiet shift was underway, invisible but irreversible, as survival gave way to resistance, and the man who once scrubbed color from his sidewalk now studied the architecture of the cage being built around him with the intent not only to escape it, but to show the world exactly how it had been constructed, unaware that the next phase would pull his private battle into public fire. The weeks that followed the board meeting folded into one another with a relentless sameness that pressed down on Mark's sense of time, each day beginning with the same dull apprehension, each evening ending with the same quiet calculations. The numbers never quite aligning, the threat never fully retreating, and yet beneath the surface of this exhausting routine, something fundamental had shifted, because fear was no longer the only force moving him forward. The discovery of the old county case became the axis on which his life now rotated, pulling his nights away from despair and into disciplined study, and the more he learned, the more the HOA carefully cultivated image of absolute authority began to crack under closer inspection. He learned how associations derived their power not from any natural law, but from contracts layered with assumptions, how their influence depended almost entirely on residents believing that the rules were unchallengeable, and how rarely anyone truly tested where private governance ended and public protection began. Each statute he read sharpened his awareness of where the lines should have been drawn but never were, and the gap between legality and enforcement widened in his mind like a fault line waiting for pressure. Meanwhile, the HOA pressure intensified with equal focus, not through spectacle but through accumulation, fees compounding upon fees, late penalties stacking onto inspections, compounded interest applied with merciless regularity until the ledger resembled a slow avalanche rather than an itemized bill. The lien threat hardened into legal action as formal notice of intent arrived from a law firm contracted by the association, its language smooth, professional, and devastatingly impersonal, referring to his home not as shelter but as collateral, a numeric asset secured against noncompliance. Children sensed the shift immediately even without words to define it, their movements through the house growing smaller, their questions fewer, their play constrained to corners where they believed they were least likely to cause trouble even when none existed. The loss of chalk had already taught them that expression could be punished, and now the threat against their home taught them that even stability was conditional, something that could be taken if adults with authority decided it should be. Mark tried to mask the danger, tried to inflate normalcy into something convincing, but the strain showed in the slowed cadence of his speech, the weight behind his eyes, the way silence lingered longer than it should have at the dinner table. At work, the consequences continued to ripple outward as his focus fractured under the constant hum of anxiety. And when the warning from his supervisor finally arrived, polite but firm, Mark felt the convergence of risk tighten like a closing fist, realizing with chilling clarity that the HOA campaign was not merely threatening his present, but narrowing his future from multiple directions at once. It was in this compression, this intersection of financial collapse, legal encroachment, and emotional erosion, that he made the most consequential decision of his life, not impulsively, but with the slow gravity of inevitability, the decision to stop treating the HOA as an authority and begin treating it as an opponent. He contacted a real attorney for the first time, not one bound by volunteer limitations or community scope, but one whose career had been shaped by disputes at the fault lines between private power and public law. The consultation was brief, expensive, and sobering, but also clarifying, because while the attorney confirmed that the case would be an uphill fight, he also confirmed that the pattern of enforcement, the escalation without new violations, and the financial leverage applied through excessive penalties created a narrative that a court could not easily ignore. For the first time, Mark was no longer alone with his understanding of what was happening, and that shared recognition itself became a form of armor. The attorney began requesting formal records from the HOA, logs of inspections, enforcement timelines, internal communications referenced in procedural codes. And with each request, the association's responses grew slower and more defensive, its previously confident rhythm interrupted by scrutiny it was not accustomed to facing. Retaliation followed swiftly, not in overt acts but in intensified surveillance, inspections occurring at unusual hours, compliance notices issued with almost theatrical frequency, and though each citation appeared legitimate when isolated, together they formed a pattern too dense to be coincidence. The neighborhood's role in the conflict sharpened as well, with whispers traveling faster than facts, and Mark's reputation solidifying into a symbol of disruption inside a community built on the avoidance of discomfort. Some neighbors amplified the HOA narrative, embracing the image of him as a reckless rule-breaker who threatened their property values simply by existing under dispute, while others retreated into passive silence, unwilling to choose sides yet complicit through absence, and in rare fleeting moments Mark caught hints of something else behind closed curtains, flashes of uncertain sympathy quickly withdrawn when his eyes met theirs. The psychological toll deepened as uncertainty seeped into every corner of life, but fatigue no longer carried the same meaning it once had, because now it was layered with resolve, and resolve transformed endurance into intent. The children adapted in ways that broke his heart quietly, finding new games indoors, sketching with pencils instead of chalk, their creativity shrinking inward as if to avoid detection even when no one was watching. And it was in these moments that Mark felt the sharpest edge of his choice to fight, because the cost of resistance was not abstract. It lived in the faces of the two people he was trying to protect. The attorney moved swiftly once the HOA legal notice escalated into a formal filing, drafting an initial response that challenged not just the lien itself, but the foundation of the fines that generated it, arguing that the penalties displayed a pattern of punitive excess untethered from any corrective purpose, that enforcement had shifted from regulatory to retaliatory, and that the association had effectively weaponized ambiguity against a resident who lacked the resources to match their institutional power. When Mark reviewed the filing draft, he barely recognized his life inside the precise legal language, but the story was there nonetheless, distilled into clauses and statutes that reframed his suffering as unlawfulness. And for the first time since the nightmare began, he saw a version of himself, not as a defendant but as a plaintiff in waiting. The response was filed at the county level, lifting the conflict out of the sealed ecosystem of HOA governance and into the public machinery of the courts, and with that act, everything changed. Notifications followed, hearings were scheduled, provisional stays were issued against further enforcement tied directly to the disputed fines, and though the broader threat remained, its momentum slowed just enough to register as a break in the storm. The HOA reacted with visible agitation masked by procedural calm, issuing statements to residents emphasizing their commitment to community standards and framing the legal challenge as a reckless attack on order itself. And the narrative war quickly became as intense as the legal one. Mark became a topic of conversation in rooms he was never invited into. His name spoken with a mix of irritation, curiosity, and caution as the comfortable certainty of the HOA infallibility quietly fractured beneath the weight of scrutiny. The children felt the shift too in ways neither of them could name, an easing of the invisible pressure in the house, a return of small freedoms, a longer laugh at dinner, a song hummed absent-mindedly in the hallway, and these fragile signs of relief fortified Mark more than any legal victory could have. Yet even as the case moved forward, he understood with sober clarity that the most dangerous phase had only just begun, because now the stakes were no longer confined to fines and property. They had expanded into precedent, pride, and power, and institutions that thrive on unchallenged authority rarely relinquish it without extracting their price. And as the first court date loomed on the calendar like a gathering thunderhead, The quiet war that began with colored chalk on concrete stepped fully into the open, where retreat was no longer possible, and the outcome would ripple far beyond one household on a ordinary sidewalk. The first court date arrived not with drama, but with the suffocating weight of inevitability, a quiet morning wrapped in low clouds and procedural dread. And as Mark stood outside the courthouse, gripping the thin folder that now contained the story of his life in legal fragments, he felt the strange dissonance of knowing that everything he feared and everything he hoped now rested inside rooms governed by rules he did not write and rituals he barely understood. Inside, the air carried the sterile chill of institutional power, a cold that seeped into the bones and stripped emotion from motion, and as he took his seat beside his attorney, the HOA legal team assembled opposite him with quiet confidence, suits crisp, expressions neutral, their presence less like opposition and more like infrastructure, as if they were merely another extension of the system itself. The hearing moved with controlled restraint, arguments framed not in the language of outrage but in calibrated legal logic, and as each side presented their position, Mark listened to his life transformed into terminology of liability, jurisdiction, proportionality, and enforcement scope, his children reduced to dependence, his home reduced to secured property, his suffering reduced to an exhibit number. Yet beneath the technical precision, the core conflict pulsed unmistakably, the question of whether a private association could compound penalties beyond correction and into punishment, whether its authority to govern aesthetics extended into the right to destabilize a family's future financial strangulation. The judge listened without expression, interruptions minimal, the silence after each argument lingering like suspended breath, and when the session adjourned without immediate ruling, Mark felt the familiar frustration of waiting return, sharper now because hope had been admitted into the equation, and hope magnified uncertainty rather than softening it. Outside the courthouse, the news had already begun to spread inside the community, distorted through gossip and defensive narratives, and by the time Mark returned home that evening, the neighborhood looked the same but felt subtly altered, as if the dispute had lifted from the private shadows into shared space, where everyone would now be forced to acknowledge its existence even if they refused to understand it. HOA messaging followed swiftly, sanitized emails emphasizing unity, compliance, and financial responsibility, coupled with thinly veiled warnings that legal challenges endangered collective stability, reframing Mark's resistance not as self-preservation but as selfish disruption. And the architecture of social pressure tightened around him once more. The children felt the shift in the subtle ways children always do, sensing the change in tone behind closed doors, hearing their names spoken in hushed frustration on phone calls that stopped when they entered the room. And though the immediate threat of enforcement had slowed under the provisional court stay, the uncertainty grew heavier than the fines ever had. At work, Mark's supervisor called him in for a private meeting, this time without the buffer of patience that had softened previous warnings, and though the words remained professional, the implication landed with brutal clarity that instability, no matter how justified, was still instability, and that the shadow of his legal conflict had begun to drift into spaces he could not afford to lose. The convergence of risks pressed down on him with renewed force, but something had changed in the way he absorbed the weight, because desperation had given way to endurance sharpened by purpose, and even as fear persisted, it no longer stood alone. The HOA legal team moved aggressively between hearings, filing motions aimed at narrowing the case, attempting to sever the lien from the enforcement narrative, and framing the remaining fines as routine administrative matters beyond the court's concern, and each maneuver forced Mark's attorney to respond with precision and speed, the backhand forth unfolding like a chess match played with lives instead of pieces. Discovery opened cracks into the HOA internal processes, and as documents began to surface, patterns of selective enforcement emerged with unnerving clarity, records showing that minor violations elsewhere had resulted in warnings or modest corrections, while Mark's citations escalated rapidly without parallel measures taken against others, and the uneven contours of enforcement began to resemble not coincidence, but strategy. The deeper the case moved into inspection logs and internal emails, the more evident it became that once Mark had been classified as noncompliant, the system had shifted from correction into containment, treating every subsequent interaction as confirmation rather than inquiry, and this structural bias breathed life into the legal argument that the association had crossed from governance into retaliation. The emotional burden of this slow revelation was immense, because with each new document came validation of what Mark had felt in isolation for months, proof that the pressure was not imagined, and yet validation did not ease the damage already done to his home, his finances, or his children's sense of safety. The courtroom became a place where time stretched unnaturally, where minutes carried the density of hours and outcomes unfolded at glacial speed. And between each scheduled appearance, life continued to demand its unrelenting share of energy through unpaid bills, late nights, exhausted mornings, and the constant effort of presenting normalcy for two young minds that deserved better than the uncertainty they had inherited. Midway through the chapter of litigation, the first media inquiry surfaced, not through mainstream outlets but through a local community blog that specialized in property disputes and civic conflicts, and the request for comment arrived quietly in Mark's inbox like a small tremor that foreshadowed seismic change. His attorney advised caution but did not discourage it, understanding that visibility could serve as both shield and accelerant. And after nights of deliberation weighed against the quiet suffering already endured, Mark agreed to allow a limited version of the story to be published, stripped of identifying details but rich in pattern and implication. When the article went live, it traveled farther than anyone anticipated, shared across neighborhood forums, transforming whispered gossip into public discourse almost overnight. And with it, the narrative began to loosen from the HOA grip as questions emerged where certainty once reigned. Comments fractured along familiar lines, some defending rigid order as the backbone of property value, others recoiling at the notion that children's sidewalk art could be weaponized into foreclosure. And for the first time since the conflict began, the moral gravity of the case entered collective debate rather than remaining buried in private files. The HOA responded with renewed messaging, emphasizing their adherence to governing documents and painting the dispute as a matter of willful noncompliance rather than punitive excess. But their tone shifted perceptibly, sharpening at its edges as public scrutiny replaced internal silence. Internally, the legal posture tightened as well, and new settlement offers appeared that Mark would have once considered salvation, offers that would dissolve the lien and reduce the fines in exchange for full admission of fault and permanent waiver of future claims, tempting exits disguised as compromises, each one carrying the unspoken warning that continued resistance would not be forgiven. Mark weighed these offers in the long, quiet hours after his children slept, the temptation of safety pulling against the knowledge that acceptance would not only erase his claim, but also reinforce the machinery that had crushed him, allowing it to continue its work unchallenged upon the next vulnerable resident. With steady resolve shaped by months of endurance, he refused them all. The refusal deepened the trench lines, and the case moved toward a decisive phase as experts were brought in to analyze proportionality, consumer protection standards, and the boundary between private contracts and public harm, their testimonies weaving the technical architecture through which Mark's suffering would be judged. The children sensed the intensifying gravity even without understanding its source, and on nights when sleep eluded them, they drifted into Mark's room seeking the wordless comfort of proximity, their presence anchoring him to the reason the battle mattered beyond principle or precedent. As the next major hearing approached, one that would determine whether the court would allow the punitive enforcement pattern to remain the central question, the weight of possible futures pressed harder than ever, yet beneath the uncertainty ran a growing current of inevitability, the sense that something irreversible had already been set in motion, that even if he were to lose, the structure he had forced into the light would never return fully to shadow. The war that began with silent fines and eroding color had now crossed into the public conscience, and regardless of outcome, it had already shifted the equation of power between resident and institution in ways that could not be undone, even as the final battle still waited ahead. The next phase of the case unfolded with a quiet violence that did not rely on spectacle, but on pressure applied from every direction at once. and as the discovery process widened, it became clear that the HOA had not expected to be forced into transparency. Its internal rhythms built around the assumption that residents would tire, bend, or break long before paperwork ever reached a public judge. Mark's attorney received waves of documents, some carefully organized, others released reluctantly in chaotic batches that betrayed a deeper anxiety beneath the formal precision. And as the records were sorted into timelines and patterns, the narrative of escalation hardened into something undeniable, a steady climb of penalties disconnected from corrective intent and increasingly tethered instead to financial leverage. The inspection logs revealed frequency levels that dwarfed ordinary enforcement, showing that Mark's property had been examined more often in 3 months than most homes were in 3 years. And internal notations began to surface that, while subtle in language, carried the unmistakable implication of targeting rather than neutrality. Phrases referencing non-compliant residents as risk factors, revenue sensitivity discussions tied to enforcement quotas, and board-level concerns about deterrence through example painted a portrait of governance that no longer resembled community stewardship but rather operational control. When these findings were folded into supplemental filings, the tone of the case shifted decisively, and the HOA prior posture of procedural calm began to crack under the weight of exposure. At the same time, the community itself started to fracture along invisible fault lines that had never mattered before, neighbors quietly dividing into those who feared the destabilization of authority and those who feared the unchecked authority itself far more. Mark felt the shift when incidental kindness returned in cautious fragments, a waved hello that lingered longer than obligation required, an anonymous grocery gift left on the porch without a note, small gestures that carried no allegiance but acknowledged humanity in the space where it had long been suspended. Still, for every sign of softening, there came equal measures of hostility, whispered complaints escalating into formal grievances, anonymous reports filed over trivialities that no longer even pretended to be about compliance but existed solely to exhaust him, and the emotional toll of existing under constant surveillance deepened even as legal momentum grew. At work, the instability finally culminated in temporary leave disguised as concern, officially framed as an opportunity to manage personal matters but understood clearly by everyone involved as a warning wrapped in courtesy. And with his income reduced to irregular contract shifts, the financial pressure returned with renewed force at the worst possible moment. Yet even as money thinned and uncertainty clawed back into the margins of stability, Mark felt an unfamiliar steadiness take root, not confidence in victory but acceptance of conflict. The calm that comes not from believing one will win, but from knowing one will not surrender. The children moved through this season with the solemn adaptability only children forced into adult uncertainty can possess, their questions returning now in careful increments rather than bursts of innocence. And though they still did not know the full scope of what unfolded around them, they understood that something heavy lived at the edges of their lives, something that made their father quieter and stronger in unfamiliar ways. The media attention widened as well, crossing from isolated blogs into regional outlets that treated the story not as isolated drama, but as a symptom of a broader imbalance between private governance and public protection. And with each new article, Mark's name traveled farther beyond the boundaries that had once defined his world. The HOA attempted to contain the narrative through carefully worded press statements that leaned heavily on contractual obligation and individual responsibility. But the public language of the conflict had begun to turn against them, with phrases like punitive enforcement, predatory governance, and economic intimidation entering the collective vocabulary where community standards once reigned unchecked. The legal turning point arrived when the court granted full review of the enforcement pattern as a central issue rather than a peripheral grievance, a decision that lifted the case out of narrow technical dispute and into a broader assessment of institutional conduct. And with that ruling, the HOA lost the protective shelter of fragmentation that had previously insulated each fine as an isolated event. Now the entire arc of escalation would be examined as a unified strategy rather than a series of coincidences, and the implications of that shift rippled outward immediately. Behind closed doors, settlement offers intensified, growing increasingly generous and increasingly urgent, no longer framed as administrative compromise but as quiet escapes from a fight the association now feared could cost far more than money. And for the first time, those offers contained acknowledgments that the enforcement process may have been imperfect, a word chosen carefully to avoid admitting what everyone now understood as deliberate. Mark studied each offer with his attorney in the same quiet room where he once sorted violation notices alone, and though the temptation to end the war weighed heavily against months of exhaustion, he felt the clarity of purpose cut through the fog that once blurred every hard choice, because settlement now would not only end his ordeal, but would bury the mechanisms that had harmed him beneath confidentiality clauses and negotiated silence, erasing the opportunity for precedent before it could ever be carved. Meanwhile, the HOA internal solidarity began to strain under the pressure of exposure, with quiet resignations passing unnoticed by most residents, but registered clearly within the machinery itself, and board positions that once promised authority now carried the threat of scrutiny. Responsibility and personal liability, the unity that had powered the enforcement campaign, fractured into defensive pockets as individual members quietly recalculated their risk and distance from decisions they had once supported without question. The next major hearing loomed on the calendar with the gravity of a hinge point, anticipated not only by the litigants but by a community that now understood history might turn quietly inside a courthouse rather than loudly in the streets. And as the date approached, the tension in the neighborhood grew thick enough to be felt in ordinary moments, in the pause before greetings, in the way conversations drifted away from enforcement as though the very topic had become too unstable to touch. On the morning of the hearing, Mark stood again in that same institutional cold, but this time the energy in the room was unmistakably different, no longer tilted entirely toward presumptive authority, but unsettled by the possibility of accountability. And as expert testimony unfolded regarding proportionality standards, consumer protection doctrine, and the economic coercion of marginalized homeowners, the abstract structure of the HOA power was methodically stripped into measurable vulnerability. The judge listened longer this time, asked sharper questions, signaled with subtle precision that the court now recognized the dispute not as a private inconvenience but as a potential public harm disguised beneath contractual layers, and that recognition alone shifted the balance more than any argument could. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited where none had stood before, and as Mark stepped into the open light after hours sealed inside legal formality, he felt the weight of visibility settle onto his shoulders with equal parts fear and resolve, aware that the story was no longer his alone to carry. Children would one day search his name in places that once held only rules and silence, and that knowledge steadied him more than it terrified him, because whatever the outcome, their world would not be shaped by quiet submission alone. That night, as the house returned to its familiar evening rhythm, the first in weeks that felt even faintly calm, Mark realized that the battle had moved beyond defense and into transformation, that the system that once hunted him in shadows now moved under open observation, and though the risk remained immense, the terrain itself had changed, because power that could only function unseen rarely survives prolonged light, and the light had finally arrived in full. The weeks between the pivotal hearing and the final trial stretched with an unnatural slowness. Each day waited with anticipation of consequence, and the neighborhood itself seemed suspended in a state of collective breath, holding as if the outcome would rewrite more than one family's future. The HOA authority, once absolute and invisible, now moved with caution for the first time in its history, enforcement actions across the entire subdivision slowing to a procedural crawl as if the machine itself had learned fear, and residents who had once enforced rules with near religious certainty now hesitated with paperwork in hand, suddenly aware that power could be questioned and that consequences did not always fall in predictable directions. Mark felt the ripple effects in subtle ways, in the easing of inspections, in the disappearance of anonymous complaints, in the sudden politeness of communications that once carried only cold command. Yet the war was far from over, because the closer the final reckoning approached, the more vicious the underlying pressure became behind closed doors. The HOA legal strategy tightened into a single line of defense centered on technical legitimacy. arguing that regardless of excess or intent, the fines existed within the bylaws Mark had signed, and that legality itself should eclipse morality. And in that framing lay the core philosophical conflict that now defined the case, whether consent to governance meant surrender of protection when governance became predatory. Meanwhile, Mark's world grew smaller in preparation for the last push. His days carved into rigid units of survival, legal meetings, freelance shifts, school drop-offs, late night document reviews, and the quiet emotional labor of keeping his children steady while the unspoken future hovered above them like a storm cloud that never fully broke. The children lived inside that storm with the stoic resilience born of adaptation. Their innocence no longer shattered but reshaped into something quieter and more alert. And Mark saw in their eyes the cost of a fight they did not choose but would someday understand, a cost that made every step forward feel heavier and more necessary at the same time. Across the community, rumor hardened into camps as the approaching trial polarized sentiment with increasing sharpness, some residents clinging to institutional loyalty out of fear that undermining the HOA would unravel the perceived security of their investments, others recognizing with growing discomfort how easily the machinery could have turned against them under different circumstances. And in that division lay the true fracture of the neighborhood, not drawn by property lines but by the boundary between obedience and conscience. Offers of settlement did not stop, but they changed in tone again, now carrying hints of desperation beneath their polished phrasing, and Mark could feel the institutional anxiety tightening as the case refused to quietly disappear the way so many before it had. Confidentiality clauses grew thicker, financial concessions grew larger, and the insistence on silence grew louder, signaling with unmistakable clarity that what the HOA now feared most was not losing money but losing invisibility. The media presence deepened as well, with investigative reporters requesting records, experts weighing in on enforcement abuse, and commentators framing the conflict as a modern collision between corporate style governance and the lived reality of ordinary families. And with every new piece published, the pressure on both sides intensified under the public's unblinking attention. The courtroom itself transformed into a symbolic arena long before opening statements began, as advocacy groups monitored the proceedings, legal scholars dissected filings in real time, and thousands of unseen eyes across screens followed a story that had begun with chalk and grown into a referendum on power. When the final trial date arrived, it arrived with the combined weight of every unresolved fear Mark had carried since the first fine slipped into his mailbox. And as he stood once more at the threshold of institutional authority, the gravity of what waited beyond the doors pressed into him with a force that felt both crushing and clarifying. Inside, the atmosphere crackled with restrained tension as each side prepared to construct its final version of truth, and the arguments unfolded not as spontaneous conflict, but as the culmination of months of narrative shaping, each side seeking to define what the case truly represented. The HOA painted a portrait of contractual order, of voluntary agreement, of community stability preserved through hard but necessary enforcement. And their language sought to reduce the conflict back into paperwork, numbers, and procedure, stripping the story of faces and consequences. When Mark's side presented its case, the narrative shifted entirely, rebuilding the timeline not as isolated violations, but as a progressive campaign of economic pressure, layered so densely that it ceased to be governance and became coercion, and through expert testimony and documentary evidence. The invisible mechanics of intimidation were translated into measurable harm, the slow squeeze of escalating fines reframed as a strategy rather than coincidence. The most devastating moments arrived not with emotional appeal but with pattern recognition, charts revealing inspection disparities, financial projections illustrating how the fines were designed to outpace any realistic ability to comply, and communications that revealed deterrence through punishment as an explicit operational goal rather than an unintended outcome. Mark sat through these revelations with a strange detachment, watching his private suffering become public structure, seeing the thing that once swallowed his nights now exposed under fluorescent courtroom light, where it could no longer pretend neutrality. The children were not present, shielded deliberately from the brutal mechanics of the trial, but they hovered in every decision, every question, every answer, the silent reason behind each word spoken in sterile legal cadence. As testimony accumulated and closing arguments approached, the emotional landscape of the courtroom shifted from confrontation into reckoning, and even the HOA polished exterior showed signs of strain in the tightened expressions and recalculated phrasing that began to replace earlier confidence. Outside, the community reached a state of restless anticipation, conversations pausing mid-sentence when the case was mentioned, normal disputes feeling trivial against the looming scale of potential precedent, because what now waited on the judge's decision was not merely the fate of one family home, but the shape of authority itself inside countless similar neighborhoods. Mark no longer checked his mailbox for fines, but he checked his phone constantly for updates that could redefine everything in an instant, living inside a narrow emotional corridor where the past no longer dictated his fear, but the future held no guarantees. The final day of testimony arrived with a silence that felt heavier than sound, and as the last witness stepped down and the room settled into stillness, the gravity of what had been laid bare over weeks of proceedings hung suspended in the air like a truth too large to retreat back into shadow. Closing arguments crystallized the conflict into its purest form, one side defending the sanctity of private contracts, the other defending the boundary that must exist between rule and ruin, and as those final words settled into the judge's quiet contemplation, Mark felt the long arc of battle curve toward its inevitable end. When the judge announced that a written ruling would be issued after review, the room exhaled in collective uncertainty, and as Mark stepped back into the outside world with no victory and no defeat yet declared, the waiting returned in its most intense form, sharpened by the knowledge that everything now rested in interpretation rather than struggle. That night, as the house fell quiet and the children slept wrapped in fragile normalcy, Mark sat alone at the kitchen table where the first fine had once shattered his illusion of safety, and he understood with sobering clarity that by the next sunrise after the ruling, his life would either be restored in ways he could scarcely imagine or stripped down to consequences he had prepared himself to face without retreat. And in that understanding lay the final, silent threshold between survival and transformation. The ruling arrived not with fanfare, but with quiet finality on an ordinary morning that began like every other, the children dressing for school, the kettle warming on the stove, the mail resting untouched on the table, as though it carried nothing more than the usual weight of uncertainty. And when Mark opened the court notification with hands steady from exhaustion, rather than confidence, he felt the world pause around him in a way that did not announce itself with sound, but with absence, a sudden stillness where fear once lived. The decision unfolded in language that was precise, measured, and devastatingly clear, declaring that the HOA pattern of enforcement had crossed the boundary from governance into punitive economic coercion, that the escalation of fines far exceeded any reasonable corrective purpose, and that use of financial intimidation as a deterrent violated county consumer protection statutes, rendering the lien invalid, the accumulated excess fines unenforceable, and the enforcement framework itself subject to immediate judicial limitations. The court did not merely rule in his favor, it dismantled the mechanism that had been used against him piece by piece, declaring that no HOA within the county could impose escalating penalties disconnected from proportional correction, that aesthetic violations could not be converted into instruments of foreclosure, and that any future enforcement exceeding proportional thresholds would require external review under public law rather than private authority. As Mark read the ruling again and again, the truth of it moved slowly through him, not as celebration but as release, the sudden return of oxygen he had learned to live without. And when the meaning finally settled into his bones, he felt a quiet, shaking exhale leave his chest that carried months of fear with it. The children did not understand the language of the ruling, but they understood the change in his face when he knelt to tell them that their home was safe, that no one could take it away, that the fighting was over, and in their sudden laughter, the house seemed to breathe again for the first time in a year. The HOA response arrived swiftly and without grace, a formal acknowledgement stripped of warmth and padded with legal distancing, announcing compliance with the court's directive while avoiding any admission of wrongdoing, yet behind the sterile language, the impact detonated across the community with unstoppable force. All pending aggressive enforcement actions were frozen overnight, Fines were reviewed under new proportional standards, and residents who had once lived quietly beneath the same pressure Mark endured began to emerge with stories that mirrored his in fragments, narratives that had never reached the surface because no one before him had forced the system into the light long enough for truth to accumulate. Board members resigned with quiet speed, vacancies forming in positions that once symbolized unassailable control, and the cultural architecture of authority inside the neighborhood shifted almost immediately from fear-driven compliance into something uncertain, tentative, and newly accountable. News outlets carried the story far beyond the boundaries of the subdivision, no longer framing it as a local dispute, but as a landmark ruling that redefined the limits of HOA power across the county and beyond. Legal analysts dissecting the implications while advocacy groups elevated the case as blueprint precedent for resisting predatory governance. Mark's name traveled into spaces he never imagined, yet inside his home, the victory remained intimate and grounded, measured not by headlines but by the absence of dread in ordinary moments, by the way the children no longer whisper when they draw, by the simple, overwhelming relief of knowing tomorrow would not bring another envelope of threat. Financial consequences of the battle did not vanish with the ruling, because survival had required sacrifice that left marks no court could erase. Yet for the first time in months, Mark could rebuild without fear that every step forward would be weaponized against him. The HOA was ordered to reimburse legal costs tied to the invalidated enforcement actions, a ruling that sent ripples through their remaining reserves and signaled to neighboring associations that intimidation carried consequences now measured in public accountability rather than private suppression. Across the county, HOA rushed to revise their bylaws, emergency board meetings echoing with sudden legal caution, ambiguous enforcement language scrubbed into specificity, escalation thresholds capped by statute, and inspection protocols subjected to transparency requirements that would have been unthinkable before Mark's case shattered the illusion of absolute autonomy. The cultural shift unfolded more slowly than the legal one, but it was no less real, neighbors speaking more cautiously about compliance, questioning enforcement rather than accepting it as fate, and within Mark's own neighborhood, the divide that once isolated him softened into tentative reconciliation shaped by uncomfortable recognition. Some residents approached with quiet apologies, others with hesitant gratitude for a fight they had not dared to begin themselves, and many remained silent. Their loyalty to authority replaced not with solidarity but with retreat. Yet even that silence now carried a different meaning, no longer the silence of fear, but the silence born from recognition of limits. For Mark, the victory never transformed into triumph in the traditional sense, because the cost of war had been too deeply carved into his life for celebration to feel simple. But it transformed into something steadier and more enduring, a sense of having stood where surrender was easier and refusing to disappear quietly. Children returned to the sidewalk one afternoon months after the trial, chalk gripped in small hands that trembled more with excitement than caution. And as the first lines of color touched concrete once again, Mark watched from the porch with a stillness that carried memory and release in equal measure, knowing that this time the drawings were not merely art, but testimony etched in temporary color against a system that had once tried to erase them. No inspectors arrived, no notices followed, and the sidewalk bloomed into quiet rebellion reborn not as defiance but as normalcy reclaimed. And in that moment, Mark understood that the greatest victory was not the court order framed in legal glass, but the unremarkable return of ordinary life once held hostage by power. His story continued to echo through policy revisions, community workshops, and legal discussions long after headlines faded, not because he sought the spotlight, but because the precedent refused to stay silent, and in countless quiet living rooms across the county, families learned for the first time that submission was not the only language available to them. Time did what it always does to trauma, softening the sharpest edges while keeping the shape intact. And though the memory of threat never fully left, it no longer dictated his future the way it once had. The HOA continued to exist, smaller, slower, and now watched by the law it once operated beyond, and the neighborhood adapted to its new reality where authority required justification and enforcement demanded restraint. As seasons shifted and the sidewalk washed clean again and again by rain, Mark's life settled into a rhythm that once felt impossible. Work stabilizing, laughter returning without calculation, the future expanding beyond mere survival into possibility once again. In quiet moments, when the house was still and the children slept, Mark sometimes returned in memory to the first find, the first moment his world had trembled without warning, and he understood with sober clarity how easily everything could have been different if fear had won that day. Exhaustion had silenced him before resistance took shape. But fear had not won, and silence had not lasted, and through one ordinary father's refusal to vanish quietly under procedural cruelty, the invisible lines of power had been redrawn, not by force or spectacle, but by endurance sharpened into resolve, and as the chalk dust settled beneath the open sky one final time, its colors fading gently as all temporary things do, the change it represented remained permanent, etched not into concrete, but into law, memory, and the quiet courage that now lived where fear once ruled.